probably don't want to applaud until after you hear me talk. Just in case.
Well, we were applauding for Iconoclasm.
Oh! There you go. All right. Small bit of housekeeping before we get going. Again, I'm the CTO of iTrellis. We are a fledgling consulting shop. We're just getting started. The company was founded about 6 months ago. We based out of Seattle, and we are not a .NET shop. We are not a Java shop. We are a consulting shop. We practice no technicism whatsoever. So if you're Node, Ruby, .NET, Java, God help us all if you're still using COBOL, we'll talk to you. Okay. Second housekeeping note, I will warn you right now, this talk is rated PG-13. If you are under the age of 13, please leave. Is there anyone who has been under the age of 13 anywhere this century? Okay, just making sure. No, Greg, not act as if you're 13. Actual age 13. Yeah, I'm not going to swear like a sailor, but I do want to give you the heads up that there may be one or two bad words that appear in the slides and or slip out of my mouth, just to give you a heads up. Do you know who these people are? These folks are, in fact, your competition. In this particular case, that was a group of people working out of India on, I believe, some graphic driver stuff. If I'm not mistaken, I think that was the NVIDIA logo behind them from a couple of years ago. When I was a kid, and this is going back a ways, but when I was a kid, it was a fairly straightforward formula that I was taught. As a matter of fact, that my parents were taught because they were the ones who in turn passed this formula on to me. The goal here was go to school, stay in school, get good grades, take those grades and use that as a springboard to the next level of schooling. So from elementary school to junior high gets you into high school you get into the cool classes, the honors classes, which will in turn get you good grades, which will allow you to go to college. Once you've gone to college, you get your 4-year degree. Perhaps you go to another couple of years of college if you want to go get your doctorate, your master's, etc. But regardless of what your actual academic path looks like, the whole point is once you go to college, once you've earned that degree, you'll be able to graduate, you'll be able to take your chosen degree and enter your chosen field, make a very decent living, get married, have kids, white picket fence, the whole 9 yards. As a matter of fact, we've built a whole bunch of mechanisms into this process designed to help us advance from one level to the next. For example, if you want to move from high school to college, there are a number of tests, probably the most famous or infamous of which is the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which has undergone a couple of revisions, I understand, since I took it way back when. Just to make sure you understand this, the importance, the severity of this particular test, they have preparatory SAT tests, the PSAT. If you want to get into grad school, we have the GMAT, we have the LSAT, the MCAT. We also have a variety of tests that other organizations have used. For example, there is the Wonderlic, which is designed to measure your cognitive processing capabilities. Not really an IQ test. It's intended to be a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more processing-oriented, logic and whatnot. As a matter of fact, the NFL uses the Wonderlic as a way to test the rookies coming into the league. It's basically the part of the NFL draft that you don't see. Everybody watches those guys run out and run the 40 in 4 seconds or 4 days if you're one of the linemen or what have you. But there are all these tests designed to help you prove your mental capacity. As a matter of fact, we have tests that are designed to try to tell you what field you should go into. Be able to test your logical processing capability and one such. I took one of these tests when I was in junior high school. They told me I should become a priest. Now, why do you find that interesting? You don't know me well enough yet to be laughing. Anyway, There's a whole bunch of these structures, there's a whole bunch of this system designed to funnel you to a point where you can make a pretty decent living coming out of college. The formulas, well, changing is perhaps a generous term. A more perhaps apt term for a lot of the kids that are graduating today is perhaps broken. There are a lot of kids who are graduating today who have that 4-year degree and can't find a job. I read a statistic recently that fully 1/4 of the graduates who are coming out of universities today are making minimum wage jobs. They're making minimum wage at minimum wage jobs. And on top of that, we get all these statistics about all of the competition that is emerging from all over the world. India produces 350,000 engineering graduates each year. China produces almost as many, and as a matter of fact, given the way populations climb, I wouldn't be surprised if they surpass the engineering grads as what we produce in the United States here. As a matter of fact, I think I heard somewhere if we talk about graduates in general, China actually produces more than the United States and a couple Western countries combined. It's not just them, though. We can't just point our fingers at Asia and say, bad countries, and leave it at that. It's all over the place. Egypt, Brazil, Egypt particularly before the recent spate of troubles of the Arab Spring and whatnot, Egypt was very quickly turning out a large number of engineering grads. Brazil is very quickly becoming a favored destination for outsourcing and whatnot, largely because Brazil, we don't have the same time zone issues that we do with the rest of the world. Anybody notice that you can actually watch the World Cup games during the day? That's part of that time zone issue. It's nice to be able to be at work during normal business hours if you want to go talk with your various outsourcing partners. I just came back from a conference last week in Poland, Krakow, Poland, down in the southern part of the Polish nation, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Ukraine. Eastern Europe is very quickly turning into also a hotbed of technology and people who are interested in doing more of it. And normally we wouldn't care. I mean, great, India produces a bunch of engineering graduates. Beautiful, that just means we have more people to talk shop with, except that they can live in their respective countries on a lot less than we can. As a matter of fact, it's not uncommon for them to be making 1/10 the salary that we make. Is this a question or a comment?
A quick comment. I heard a statistic I couldn't believe. 4 out of 5 graduates from today's universities still have not found a job in this month of June. And they've all graduated with BS degrees and whatever, I don't know. But I don't know if it's true. 4 out of 5, no jobs.
Well, some part of that is because we have to party first. Right? You get done with college, you're owed at least 3 months of just spring break, right? And that's a given. But it is. I mean, we do definitely see a lot of college grads, and there's a lot of speculation. I saw a recent piece, I think it was in Wired magazine, that was talking about the cost of college education, is it a bubble, et cetera, et cetera. And we certainly see a lot of the foreign nationals, taking. I don't want to say taking these jobs. It's not like they walked in, held a gun to the HR manager's face and said, give me that job. They were given the job. They hired, they successfully passed the bar, they got hired. So, question is, what do we do? Well, I'm going to segue here for just a second and ask, do you know who this is? Yep. The guy that raced the railroad train. His name is John Henry. We're not entirely sure if he's a mythical figure or if he's based on a real person or not. The historians are somewhat divided over this. But pretty much everybody, particularly if you were alive during the 60s and 70s, knows about him because, for example, Johnny Cash did a very, very popular song around him, around the steel driving man. The story here is that John Henry was one of those very brave, very adventurous souls who laid the railroad down during the heyday of the Wild West, essentially connecting the country between the East and the West Coast. And he was known as a steel driving man because, of course, you used a hammer to, you lay down the track, you laid on the tie, you lay down the track, and then you take this hammer and pound these rather large spikes to anchor the whole thing to the ground so that it didn't all fly apart when a train came across it. And according to legend, There was a man who came by with a steam-powered drill, specifically for digging holes through mountains. That was another thing that John Henry was particularly good at, was knocking holes through large slabs of rock. And when this man came by with the steam-powered drill and suggested that this represented the obsolescence of man, of hammer men, as John Henry was, John Henry challenged him to a race. And Cash immortalized this in song. But the story is that the race begins, and initially John Henry is winning the race, but over time, because John Henry is human, the drill starts to catch up and eventually surpasses him. As they get nearer and nearer to the finish line, John Henry exerts this superhuman effort and barely ekes out a victory, and then dies. Collapses from exhaustion and dies. Do you know who that is? That is Kasparov. Perhaps the finest chess player of his generation, perhaps the greatest of all time. Dude has redefined success as far as competitive chess playing is concerned. Won his first championship in 1985, and for the next 10 years, never lost a match. I mean, maybe he played his grandkids and threw one just for them, but nobody knows about it. Dude is a really good chess player. And in 1997, decided to challenge IBM's Deep Blue to a match. Okay, it wasn't like he woke up one morning and said, I think I'll play the computer today. It was definitely designed as kind of a PR stunt. IBM wanted to test the depth of their artificial intelligence mechanisms and whatnot, and he lost. Well, can't really say that he lost. Effectively what happened is he played the first match, won. The second match, however, he lost, and he was so shaken by it that for the next several matches he really couldn't recover and eventually yielded. Eventually just kind of gave up and said, wow, this is much harder than I thought, which technically counts as a loss. The fact of the matter is he lost. First time in a long, long time, and he lost to a computer. Fortunately, he didn't die, though, because in chess we don't kill you. That's just football. Automation is a scary thing. There's a whole bunch of software that's out there that is essentially taking jobs away from us. There is software that does a variety of things that human beings used to do. I mean, think about even what we do on a daily basis. It used to be that human beings would actually lay down the assembly code that the machine would execute. Today we have software that does that for us. We call it a compiler. Now, in theory, what this allows us to do is allows us to think at a higher level, allows us to be able to do a bunch of things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise because we were so busy thinking about the physical structure of the code, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, we could conceivably do all of that with human beings. We could, in fact, write down this high-level code and then hand it off to a team of programmers who would then implement it at the lowest levels, obeying all the same basic rules that a compiler would and so forth. But it's not just programming. Matter of fact, we're seeing outsourcing in a variety of different industries as well. For example, used to be that every family had a lawyer. Used to be that, in fact, if you wanted to draw up a will, if you wanted to draw up a trust, if you wanted to sign over power of authority, if you wanted to get divorced, you would have a lawyer, you would walk into the lawyer's office, you would pay the however many hundreds of dollars per hour that the lawyer charged, and this was your family lawyer. Today, if you want a divorce, you can go up to www.legalzoom.com, or I think there's probably a divorcemenow.com based out of Vegas, just to kind of keep things in balance, right? There's so many websites out there that can give you that legal capability. If, for example, you're feeling a little under the weather, used to be you had a family doctor. Matter of fact, if you're old enough, you remember the days when the doctor would actually come to you. You'd call the doctor and say, Doc, I ain't feeling so well, or little Johnny's running a fever, and the doctor would hop in his car and he'd drive out to your place of residence, and he would say, yep, Johnny has a cold, take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning. And then if things got worse, the doctor might say, okay, well, let's take Johnny to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Today, what do? You go up to webmd.com. and discover that you are currently suffering from at least 3 fatal diseases. Because unfortunately, despite the fact that WebMD provides you with all of that data, we are not Dr. House, and we suck at running a medical diagnostic. So if it's really serious, then you take little Johnny into the urgent care where the nurse conducts the diagnostic with the help of WebMD. All of this information, all of this processing is moving up into software. As a matter of fact, there are stories, I haven't verified this, but there are stories that at a medical conference not too long ago, there's a gentleman who stood up and said, look, I have here x-rays from real patients, because they do that a lot. I have x-rays here, and I put them onto this flatbed scanner-like thing, and I push the button. And a couple of minutes later, what comes back is a printout describing what we're seeing in this x-ray. Okay, this is clearly a fractured left fibula, this is clearly a separated right shoulder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the medical community was like, oh my God, this is amazing, and they gave him a standing ovation. This was awesome, until they discovered that what was happening is he was faxing it to a team of doctors in India who were looking at the x-rays and typing up their diagnosis and sending it back. And then they were outraged. I don't know why. Quite frankly, that strikes me as an implementation detail. Does it really matter whether it's software that does it or whether it's a team in India that does it? At the end of the day, this is a potential x-ray technician or a doctor that is allowing something else to perform that diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just us that is feeling the pinch of automation. It's everywhere. As a matter of fact, in some quarters, there are people who are really wondering. For a long time, we were okay with automation because robots were replacing the blue-collar worker. Robots were replacing the traditional factory line worker. And those of us who were building the robots and writing the software were okay with it. We were saying, oh, well, those blue-collar folks, they should retool. They should learn a new trade. They should learn something useful. Maybe we'll, drive down through Michigan, maybe go through Detroit and hand out learn to program books to all those who can't find a job. But now we're talking about white-collar jobs being replaced by software, and that ain't cool. That's not okay. So, given that we, all of us, want to have a job, and quite frankly, I will speak very gender stereotypically here for a moment, we men, who, quite frankly, society sort of defines us as being the providers of the household. If you can't find a job, if you can't make money to keep your family healthy and hale and fed and sheltered and clothed and whatnot, I mean, that gets right there. That gets to right at the corner definition of who you are as a man. So what do men do? We fight. I feel like I should be wearing blue paint, right? They can't take our software! Nobody? Braveheart? Nobody? Really? All right, fine. How do we stop this? We can't. The automation continues. What, no Battlestar Galactica fans in here either? Come on, guys. Seriously, we can't stop this. All we can do, wait for it, is evolve. Not quite where I was going with that, but that's another Battlestar Galactica reference. But you know what? It kind of works. We'll go with it. We'll go with it. Do you know who this is? He's not a name that you'd recognize. He's not a face that you'd recognize. As a matter of fact, he is a stock photo image I ripped off of the internet somewhere. But what he represents is the guy at your company that sits there and stares out the window. It doesn't really seem to ever be doing any real work. He's just kind of lost in his own thoughts. And you're, banging away at the keyboard, right? Like somehow you're getting paid by the letter or something. And at one point you go to your boss or your boss's boss and say, I don't mean to be that guy, but, or that woman, doesn't quite work quite as well. I don't want to be snarky, but this guy doesn't seem to be doing anything. Why are we paying him? And that's when you find out that this is the guy who had the amazing, brilliant, incredible idea that made the company $150 million last year. How many of you are familiar with Intel? Right? How many of you are familiar with that 4-tone Intel inside? Do, 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 do. How many of you are familiar with that? How many, if I sang that to you out of the blue on the middle of the street, would know instantly that Intel was somewhere around you? This idea almost never happened. This idea, this very simple 4-note tune that Intel has hammered into your brain for the last 20 years, almost didn't happen. This was the brainchild of a junior marketing executive at Intel. And he tried to run it up through the usual marketing channels. And most of the marketing people were like, "You're stupid. That is the most idiotic thing we have ever heard, that we would have, what, a 4-note theme song? I mean, come on. We went down the path of the multimedia extravaganza. I don't know if you remember when the Pentium chip came out, but Intel went with this whole rockin' bunny suit theme, right? Guys in these metallic bunny suits, and all of a sudden, they're working in a very sterile white environment. All of a sudden, the Pentium somehow gets plugged in, and it's all disco balls and hip-hop music, and they're in pastel-colored bunny suits, and they're dancing, which, when you see engineers dancing, it's really ugly. And it was a miserable failure. I mean, that campaign was just unbelievable. It was supposed to somehow hearken that the additional processing power capability on the Pentium would allow you to do all this multimedia stuff, and disco balls and dancing engineers in bunny suits was supposed to evoke images of multimedia. And as marketing things go, it was a horrible failure, which is why that campaign lasted about 3 months and then died. So this junior marketing executive came and actually did what he wasn't supposed to do. He bypassed his bosses, and he went to Andy Grove and said, "Hey boss, I have an idea." And Andy said, "Let's give it a shot. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? We'll fire you if it doesn't work." Right? Seems reasonable. Tried it out, and actually the various focus groups latched onto that thing. They didn't remember anything. After watching like 15 minutes of television with a couple of Intel commercials interspersed, the only thing they remembered were those 4 notes. Which is why Intel has used that ever since, regardless of the chip, regardless of the context. I mean, hell, they could be advertising an Android phone, but if it's running an Intel chip in it, it's part of their marketing contracts now that you must include as a part of the commercial. Because that tells everybody, ooh, Intel, which is supposed to be synonymous with quality, processing power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That guy came up with the idea. And the interesting thing about him is that you can be him. Jobs is, of course, revered throughout the valley for the way in which he turned Apple around. And it's hard in this day and age, particularly with his passing so recently upon us, it's hard for us to really kind of remember in some objective fashion. Jobs was not really the world's greatest businessman. And the way in which he conducted business that led up to his ouster from Apple years and years and years ago, the first time, kind of lays testament to that. But Jobs was sitting around, and he had the absolutely ridiculous idea that Apple should create yet another music player. Because remember, back in the time of the iPod, it was not the first. And in a lot of respects, it was not the best. There were a lot of people that looked at the various music players that were out on the market and said, wow, there are music players that have more storage, that have easier file system storage capabilities, etc. But what Jobs did is he said, look, people don't want to have a tiny little computer that plays music. They want to have a music player. I don't want to see the computer. And so he simplified the design. And he created that click wheel, which, interestingly enough, the very thing that iPod was advertised around, right? Remember the little click wheel? That was that's part of the icon, for crying out loud, is the click wheel that has disappeared like 8 years ago. You can be him. You can design the next iPod. You can create that perfect solution. Now, I'm not promising you that you will be able to come up with an idea that will make you the next Steve Jobs. I mean, it kind of helps to have several $100 million behind you to start, right? There's the ancient saying, how do you make $1 million in the Silicon Valley? Start with $2 million. But if you can come up with that suggestion, that idea, that concept, that thing, whatever that is, that the rest of the company says, wow, yes, that makes everything so much easier, so much better, so much more profitable, so much rejuvenates our market, whatever, you can be that person, they will never, ever let you go. You want to be an iconoclast. A person who does something that others say cannot be done. If you had suggested, if you had jumped into your handy time-traveling machine and you had traveled back to 2000 or to 1995, and if you had said, hey, by the way, Steve Jobs is not only going to be returned to Apple, but he will invent the most popular portable music player ever, despite the fact that the market is saturated with them. He will make the Walkman disappear. He will make the idea of carrying any sort of portable media to plug into the device disappear. And he will turn Apple around from a 2% market share to a, what are we looking at now, 30, 40, 50% market share? Certainly I go to developer conferences, everybody's carrying a Mac. Everybody. As a matter of fact, when I hook up my Windows machine, people look at me with a certain amount of pity in their eyes. No, I got 2 Macs in my backpack, I swear, I'm still cool.
Someone runs Ubuntu the same.
No. I want to be cool, not weird. The iconoclast, a person who does something that others say cannot be done. If you had described all of these things, if you had described Steve Jobs' success to people prior to him achieving that success, they'd have told you it was flat out impossible. They'd have told you that the Windows operating system monopoly on the personal computer market was unshakable. Talk to DR-DOS, talk to Digital, talk to all of the various players who have tried over the years. Talk to Sun, who went bankrupt trying to convince people that Java could be the platform. And Sun stood there and told us for years that mobile would be big. And it was. And when it was, Apple won. Not Microsoft, not Sun, Apple. You want to be one of those. Because if you can be one of those, nobody will ever get rid of you. The term actually dates back from history. In the 700s, the Roman Emperor, and I should say the Holy Roman Empire, because if you remember your ancient history, Rome started suffering from a series of barbarian attacks. That is to say, tribes were driven out of the steppes of Asia by the Huns, the Mongols. They've gone by several names over the centuries. They were driven west because the Mongols said, join us or die. And the various tribes said, we'll choose the third option. We'll go this way. And so they swarmed into the Roman Empire and essentially split it in two. The fall of Rome is generally considered along the lines of the sacking of Rome, the first sacking of Rome. And Rome was split into two parts, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire, whose capital was at Byzantium, which is Constantinople, which is now, of course, part of Turkey. Leo III was sitting on his throne. Now remember, this is during the era of Christianity. This is the era that Christianity really started to take over the world, at least in the known world, which as far as Western historians is concerned, sort of begins with the Atlantic and ends with the Carpathian Mountains, right? Because only Europe really matters as far as we're concerned. North of the Mediterranean, of course. During that time, emperors were crowned by popes. And the symbolism here was very, very clear. Right? Yes, you wear the crown, but I gave it to you, says the Pope. Your secular power is subject to that of the church. If the church doesn't like a law that you want to pass, well then, we gave you your crown, we can take it away as well. And so the church said, we're okay with this, but Leo was not. And Leo actually, when he looked at his throne, the church images were above and behind his throne. The crosses and the various gilding and whatnot. he actually stepped up onto the back of his throne and tore down those images, those icons, and destroyed them, saying, my empire is ruled by secular authority. That is to say, mine. The church does not rule me. He became a destroyer of icons, an iconoclast. And at the time, again, people said, there is no way that you can break the power of the church like this. And as a matter of fact, it became an ongoing struggle between secular and religious authorities in Western Europe, all the way up through the Reformation. Since that time, since Leo first tore down the Christian icons and threw them to the ground, there have been certain individuals that have come along and said, I don't see the world the way you do. I see it differently, and I'm going to act and do something, which other people told them in some cases point blank to their face, that cannot be done. And they said, no, it really can, and let me show you how, and they did it. They didn't just say it, they did it. The list is obviously longer than just this, but these are some of the folks that we're going to be talking about. Some of these names you may well recognize, some of them you may not, and that's okay. We're going to talk about them. There are a number of iconoclasts within our industry as a whole. For example, Alan Kay, Smalltalk, object-oriented programming, and to be more precise about it, dynamically typed object-oriented programming. We have Linus Torvalds, who of course created Linux, that operating system, because only big players could in fact create operating systems. But the idea of taking the code for operating system, putting it out into the world so anybody could work on it, and then creating an actual reliable operating system on which lots of things like Ubuntu is later based. And on top of that, he invented a source control system that actually works better for people working in a distributed fashion. Linus is, it's almost like he does 3 impossible things before breakfast. We have Dave Thomas. Dave almost single-handedly created the Ruby revolution. Dave, of course, is Dave Thomas, pragmatic programmer Dave, and for a long time he was, like everybody else, he was working within Java and whatnot. And he discovered this language called Ruby at one point and said, this is an interesting language, I'm going to play around with it. Started talking about it at a lot of conferences and started using it in a number of places. Lots of people looked up to him, particularly because he's known as one of the 2 pragmatic programmers, he and Andy Hunt, very, very popular book. When they started talking about Ruby, people stood up, took notice. Then later, when David Hannemeyer Hansen came around, he created Ruby on Rails, and all of a sudden you didn't have to create 17.java files and 14.xml files in order to ship a hello world web app. You could actually do it with like 1 line of Ruby code. Everybody went, whoa, wait a minute. You really? This actually works? And of course we have people from computing history. Edward Dijkstra, go-to considered harmful. And we've got Robin Milner, who created the slew of functional languages that we're starting to see taking shape here. ML and some of the family of languages that followed. We definitely have some iconoclastic people within our industry that have changed things up. If you had suggested in the year 2000 that all of the cool kids of Java by 2005 would have fled Java and would in fact be working in this dynamically typed scripting language, that there wouldn't be a compiler, and that it would in fact be able to build web applications and not throw exceptions everywhere, people would have told you you're crazy. You have to have Java. Java is clearly the heir apparent to C++, and you couldn't possibly imagine doing a large-scale project unless you have a compiler there to save you from shooting yourself in the foot. All those million-line Ruby projects clearly are a figment of everybody's imagination. But Dave did it. Your goal, very bluntly, is to become an iconoclast. This is not easy. This is not like you wake up in the morning and say, I'm feeling iconoclastic today. It's not quite that simple. We're going to talk about what this really means. It means that you need to see the world differently. And I don't mean you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to put on a weaker pair of glasses so that everything's fuzzy, or I'm going to put on a stronger pair of glasses so that I hurt my eyes, or I'm going to go out and hit my head against a wall often enough until I see spots. There's a very different approach, and unfortunately, it's not something I can say, go do this, and this is how you see the world differently. But we'll talk about some of the examples of what that really means. We'll get a better idea. You also have to be able to overcome fear, because there is a deep-seated fear in all of us about being the one that stands out. There is a very well understood proverb in Russia that says the nail that sticks out is the one that gets hammered down. And particularly within big corporate structures, it's interesting. I wouldn't say ironic. Perhaps it's appropriate. Perhaps it's intriguing that we're doing this inside of HP, which is one of those big corporate structures that tends to encourage people to just kind of go with the flow. Don't stand out. Don't be different. And HP is actually more comfortable with people exposing ideas, innovating, etc., from the rank and file than, say, other companies like, for example, Facebook or Microsoft, where unless your name appears on the founder's agreement, your idea is not any good until you've convinced them that your idea is good. The last thing is you need to exercise social intelligence. You have to be able to get your message across to people such that they accept it. Because even if you see something differently and you overcome the fear of standing up to say, the emperor has no clothes, if you are not convincing, you are merely Cassandra, who can see the future, but could never, in fact, convince anybody of what was coming, because she actually had the audacity to resist Apollo when he said, hey baby, let's go to bed. Seeing the world differently. Your brain. Fascinating piece of hardware and software. It operates on about 40 watts of power, which means that the laptop in your lap, the lights in the ceiling above us, certainly the desktop that you might use, the servers that we run the internet as a whole on, they all use far more power. The average desktop machine is shipping with like 400, 500 watt power supplies, 10 times the amount of electrical processing that goes on inside your brain. And part of that is just, that's the way we've evolved, or the way the giant flying spaghetti monster designed us, or however, whatever your particular personal beliefs are, this is the way we are. It's probably not going to change anytime soon. And your brain has actually figured out ways to maximize its efficiency given that relatively limited amount of power. It takes a large number of shortcuts. I'm going to ask you, what do you see here? A drawing. Thank you, Captain Obvious. We see a Star of David. Where do we see the Star of David? I'm sorry, because the Star of David is like two triangles, right? Yeah. What if I told you that there is no second triangle? What if I told you that, in fact, when I drew this out, I very deliberately did not put that second triangle there? Now, your brain sees it because the other parts around it very clearly imply that there is, in fact, a gray background, 3 black circles, a white triangle, and then another gray triangle on top of that. That's what your brain processes. Because your brain looks at that very recognizable shape and says, yes, I can definitely see that second triangle there. But I can tell you for a fact that if we go look at the original graphic that I used to do this, there is not that second triangular shape there. There's nothing there. I cut it out deliberately. Your brain is taking the shortcut. Your brain is saying, I think I recognize what I see, therefore I'm going to interpret it as such. Now this is a very interesting bit of biological trivia, because that means that what we see, that what is so obvious to us when we look at it, and this is just one of many different optical illusions, they're playing off the fact that perception is a matter of the brain, not the eye. The eye does no interpretation of the data whatsoever. It's a very dumb sensor. All it does is relay the signals to the brain. The brain is the one that turns around and figures out what it is that we're looking at. This is another one of those optical illusions. Which of these two horizontal lines, between these two vertical lines, which one is longer? They are, in fact, exactly the same. Now, how many of you are saying that because you just know it, as opposed to I'm looking at it and I can see You're doing what he's doing back there. He's like, okay, let me. Yeah, it's, allowing for a certain amount of fudge factor, the fact that I have fat fingers, and the fact that there's some distance, they look like they're the same. But when you look at this, the optical illusion clearly wants, what your brain is trying to convince you, is that that top line is in fact longer than that bottom line. Why? Perspective. It's exactly right. Because, let me remove those two horizontal lines for just a second, and what we're looking at is we're looking at two parallel lines stretching off into the distance. If you were to actually, go out to Interstate 80 and drive east of, say, Davis or so, I used to live in Davis a long time ago, and if you were to stand there in the middle of the freeway, don't do this during rush hour, if you were to stand there in the middle of the freeway, you can see that these are in fact two parallel lines, but they stretch off into the distance, and it looks like if you could just see far enough, they might actually touch. And after a few years of seeing that, when you're a very, very wee child, your brain learns, that is a picture of two parallel lines running off into the distance. Same thing happens when we look at buildings. Go to downtown San Jose, stand at the base of one of those skyscrapers, and look up. And sure enough, it looks like it's coming to a point, like it's some kind of pyramid. And yet, when you step back and get a little height, you can clearly see that this building is in fact a square, a cube. It's cube-ish. Now, what we're seeing here, that is to say what we're perceiving here, is the brain being trained to see those two lines as a matter of perspective. Now, look at that for just a second. Remember, the goal here is to identify whether or not those two horizontal lines are in fact the same length. Let me challenge you again. Are those two horizontal lines the same length? How many of you can see it without even having to do this? Why is that? Because we don't ever see this. We don't ever see two vertical lines sloping towards us, unless in fact they are non-parallel lines that are about to cross right in front of us. This image does not occur naturally. And our brain says, I'm not used to this. Why are you pointing at the ceiling, sir?
Because the lines in the ceiling are like that.
Oh, but look at the larger lines. Look at the larger thing. Look at the larger scope. We got these two very big pieces here. And in fact, when I look at the smaller lines, they stretch off together into the distance. I don't see two of them coming like this towards me. The perspective here is completely reversed. And as a result, the brain says, okay, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know, this is not a recognizable pattern. And therefore, I'm going to spend a little bit more time and energy analyzing it. And that's why it's very trivial for us to figure out that those two horizontal lines are the same length. What that means is that your brain's taking shortcuts, as I said. It is very deliberately looking for patterns. It's very deliberately looking for things that it can latch onto from your past experience that it can recognize and it can attach itself to. And it can say, aha, I know exactly how this works. The notion of perspective means that it makes it hard for us to see that those two horizontal lines are the same length, because we look back at it and we say, if these two lines are parallel, which my brain is telling me they are, I can see that there is a large gap here, but small gaps up there, therefore that line must be longer than this one. When we look at the reverse of it, we're not accustomed to seeing that, so we start processing it all from scratch. What do you see? This is what I call the universal software architecture. I don't care what you're working on. I don't care if it's a web app. I don't care if it's image processing. Everybody has a picture inside their system that looks like this. It used to be that this was client talking to server talking to database, or this was web browser talking to web server talking to database, or this is web server talking to app server talking to database. Fundamentally, I call this box, arrow, cylinder. It is the universal architecture. And, quite frankly, one of these days I'm going to patent it and take everybody's money.
What if it's 3 cylinders, side view, tilt?
could possibly happen, but they would still be represented as box, arrow, cylinder. This is the universal software architecture. And I don't, like I said, I don't care what it is. Oops. I don't, no. Sorry. Hit the end key by mistake. There we go. And if you go back in time, for example, you go back 20 years, you start thinking about some of the C++ systems that you worked on, you go back 40 years, think about some of the COBOL systems you worked on, this diagram holds. You walk into a job tomorrow, this is mobile app, talking to a web API, talking to its storage system, I don't care. This is such a recognizable diagram that if given half a chance, an architect will stand up in the middle of a project introduction meeting. You're a new employee, you come to work at the place of business, and he will stand up and he will say, our architecture is very straightforward, or he'll say it's very, very complicated, depending on whether he's trying to get you to follow along or whether he's trying to impress you so that you won't try to challenge him for his job. And he'll draw these things and say, any questions? And this leads you to believe a number of potentially very, very false impressions about how this project works. This is never an actual physical diagram. It may be that, in fact, we have several cylinders over here on the right-hand side, and these are replicants, or these are distributed databases. It may be that this middle box, in fact, is a large number of them because that's a web farm and we spray the load, whatever. It can take on a variety of images. But inevitably, when people start talking about the software architecture, it always gets distilled down to this. Do you know who this is? Yes, this is Dale Chihuly. Very, very popular figure in Seattle. He is, in fact, a glassblower who is perhaps better recognized for a lot of his work. Chihuly is a really, really fascinating character because he is, as near as we can determine, the most successful businessman artist in history. He actually exceeds Picasso in a lot of respect. He runs a studio of about 100 some odd glassblowers, and he is one of a handful of American artists who has had a solo display, a solo show at the Louvre. Okay, now with the French and their sense of all things French being superior to all other things, anything. When the French say to you, please, monsieur, come to our most amazing museum, and we will put all of the French things in the storage locker, and we will put your things out. You know that hurt. You know it hurt that French guy to say that, especially to an American. But they did. Because he is the most, perhaps, respected artist right now in our generation. His glass pieces go from anywhere from $25,000 each to well over millions of dollars. As a matter of fact, if you walk into a hotel and you see a large piece of glasswork, or onto a cruise ship, I saw one not too long ago as I was cruising down to the Caribbean. If you see a large glasswork display, chances are very, very good that it's Chihuly or one of his students. And it's interesting because the main reason for his success is because he lost an eye. Matter of fact, he lost an eye and an arm. He was out, Chihuly was having kind of a bad year. He was out cruising around with a buddy of his in the suburbs of London, as I understand it, and got into a car accident. And the doctor said, basically, you've suffered 90% damage to one eye, and there's nothing we can do about it. You know, his eye is still physically there, but he wears the eye patch because it's not particularly pretty. And then, shortly thereafter, I guess he was trying to drown his sorrows, literally, and broke his arm during a surfing accident. I don't know if you've ever done any glass blowing, but you've got to hold these really long poles which have the glob of melted glass at the end of it that you stick into the heating furnace in order to get it nice and soft before you then start to work with it. That's really hard to do one-handed. So now, not only can Chihuly not really see the depth perception required, because at the time, when Chihuly is working on his pieces, the time was, if you were doing glass, these pieces needed to be perfectly symmetrical. They needed to, if you put a mirror down the middle of it, visibly speaking, it would look the same with the mirror or without. The goal was to produce pieces that were perfectly symmetrical. And if you have no depth perception, that's really hard to do, because we need stereoscopic vision in order to be able to determine depth. So Chihuly's got one eye, one good arm. He can't really touch the glass, figuratively speaking, to be able to work with it. So he has to stand back and give directions to somebody else to work on pieces. And Chihuly says, you know what? Fuck it. I'm not going to go for the symmetrical thing. I can't. The eye won't let me. I can't do symmetry. I'm just going to go and do whatever. And so he starts producing these pieces that very clearly have no real symmetry to them whatsoever. I mean, yes, it's a circle perhaps, because it's really hard to do a square in glass. Trust me, I've tried. But he's building these sweeping pieces that are all these curves and coming in different directions and whatnot. And the glass world had never seen anything like this. And for whatever reason, they loved it. More importantly, the people buying his art loved it. And he's literally reinvented glass as we know it. You know who this is? You owe your life to her, by the way. What's that? Did she save your life? No.
Florence Nightingale.
Bingo. Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale, who is considered the paragon, the mother of modern nursing. Florence was actually she was serving with the British Army during the British War in the Crimean Peninsula. Ironic that we're talking about the Crimean again in recent world affairs. This was when the British and some of the other colonial powers were having some disagreements with some of the local powers as to who really was in control. This is also, by the way, when Charge of the Light Brigade was written, because some of the Brits were phenomenally stupid. Let's take our line of horses and ride them into the teeth of cannons. Slowly. Just ridiculously dumb. But what Florence noticed was that actually more men were dying in the medical tents than they were on the field of battle. And she realized it was because these doctors, who by the way were also surgeons, who by the way were also your barber, because hey, good with blades means good with blades, right? We'll take that scalpel and give you a shave, and then we'll take that scalpel and operate on this guy over here. We got to the point where a lot of soldiers, this is true of the American Civil War too, by the way, a lot of the soldiers would rather risk dying than go to the doctor, particularly if you had anything that wasn't like, visible damage done to you. If you had dysentery, if you had any other internal problems, cholera or whatnot, more guys died from the runs than they actually did on the field of battle. And Florence said, wow, if doctors would only wash their hands, we might actually be able to save a lot more of these guys. Florence went to the various doctors and said, this is what you should do. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the medical industry, but telling a doctor what to do is not generally a recipe for success. Particularly if you're a woman, and particularly if this is the 1800s. She got nowhere, absolutely nowhere with these learned men of science. So she went to Queen Victoria and said, Queen, men are dying, I know how to make them better. And the Queen, who had never seen a battlefield in her life, who had only received reports from her various generals and admirals, many of whom who hadn't been on a battlefield in 20 or 30 years themselves, she didn't really understand what Florence was talking about. Okay, yeah, men die in battle. Yes, men die in the medical tent. What can we do about it? Florence said, okay, Queenie, look, you got to understand, this many men die in battle. This many men die in the medical tent. And Queen Victoria went, I get it. As far as we know, this was the first practical use of a pie chart. We can only speculate what medical advances might have happened if Florence Nightingale had had access to PowerPoint. Once Queen Victoria saw the differences in numbers, and she was convinced that this wasn't just some woman, making stuff up, Queen Victoria laid down the law and said, from this point forward, doctors will wash their hands between patients. And she quite literally laid down the very early stages of what doctors now practice as basic medical hygiene. The iconoclast sees things differently. Florence Nightingale looked at these men going into the medical tents, cared for them because she was a nurse, she was working with the field, she was watching these doctors, and she noticed this pattern that doctors with dirt and dried blood under their fingernails sewing up a guy, in fact, caused that wound to be infected, as opposed to wounds which were allowed to treat themselves naturally, which didn't get infected, which didn't cause the patient to run a fever, which ended up causing the patient to die. She noticed these things. She saw them. Whereas everybody else just sort of brushed it off as, that's just the way war is. It's not like sinks and soap didn't exist long before this. Doctors could have been washing their hands for 150 years prior to this. She was just the first one to put two and two together. Dale Chihuly, forced by circumstance to see things quite literally differently than the people before him, said, okay, I'm not going to try to do what the rest of the establishment says I should do. I'm going to go for this entirely different path, which works with my particular physical disability. He was kind of forced into it. Both of them looked at the world differently. They perceived things differently and were able to draw some, once you saw that perception, very logical conclusions. It would be great if we could stop there. It'd be wonderful if I could just say, see the world differently, you're done, have a nice day. But unfortunately I can't. Do you know who they are? The Dixie Chicks, yes. Very, very popular country and western musical group. Pretty good music. I'm not a big fan of country western, but I liked a lot of their stuff. And in 2003, an entirely new iconoclast was born, almost entirely by accident. The Dixie Chicks are performing on the stage in London. They're singing their songs, etc. And as is very common during a concert, they take a short break. They got to swap out guitars and get some other stuff set up on stage. Natalie Maines, the lead singer of the Dixie Chicks, stands up in front of the audience, again, Brits, and says, we're from Texas, which is true. The three of them all were raised within the state of Texas. We're from Texas, and we're ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas. Now you have to remember, this is 2 years after 9/11. The United States has entered Iraq, conducted military operations. It's, I think, right about this time, maybe a little bit after this, that Bush is standing on the carrier deck, mission accomplished, the banner flying behind him, et cetera, et cetera. This was a very, very patriotic moment in history. And the Dixie Chicks basically stood up and said, we're ashamed of the President of the United States. Now, over in London, this was received with great cheers because nobody in Europe, not our friends the Brits, certainly not any of our quasi-friends, the rest of Western Europe, and certainly none of the sort of we want to be your friends but not your puppets over in Eastern Europe, none of them were particularly happy with President Bush's actions. As a matter of fact, if I remember my facts correctly, the only European contingents that showed up as a part of Iraqi freedom were a couple of divisions of British troops and some support ships and whatnot, and I think it was one regiment of Polish troops showed up. And there was not the second Gulf. First Gulf, it was a very multinational coalition. Second Gulf, there wasn't a whole lot of European support. Europe really didn't like what we did. When they got home, however, it was an entirely different story. Have you ever gotten a death threat? Have you ever had somebody send you an email threatening bad things to your person. There are different kinds of death threats. There are those death threats that are clearly written in haste and anger, and then there are those death threats that make the police sit up and go, wow, we need to get you some protection. You will be shot dead at your show in Dallas is not, I mean, that's about as clear and as crystal and as obvious a death threat as you can possibly get, according to police. There's a story of a guy, a radio station DJ. You know, the radio stations have these vans. They drive around to various events. They've got pictures of various rock stars and so forth on the sides of the van. This particular country and western station had a picture of the Dixie Chicks painted on the side. The driver reported that somebody pulled up next to the van on the freeway and pointed a shotgun at the driver, screaming incoherently about the Dixie Chicks. She never took it back. To this day, she abides, she upholds. She says, I meant every word of what I said. Their albums, which were routinely Billboard #1 hits, they were routinely gold, platinum, etc. hits. They were a very, very successful rock star. Their albums tanked. Radio stations could not pull their music off the air fast enough. Interestingly enough, 3 years later, when they released a new album, Billboard, which is a measure of how often songs are played on the radio, Billboard recorded their album as being way, way down there at the bottom of the charts. Nobody was playing their music, even though that album was the #1 download on iTunes. The radio stations wanted no part of them because they were a little tired of people pointing shotguns at their drivers. But clearly the American public, at least those in terms of people who are country and western stars and pay for music on iTunes, clearly they had forgiven them. I'm going to conduct a small exercise. Imagine for a moment that I put 2 urns in front of you, and I say one of them has 9 white stones and 9 black stones. The other one has an unknown mix of black stones and white stones. Okay? Now, I'm going to ask you to pull out a black marble from the urn. Which urn do you choose? The left-hand one? She's very insistent. She says we pull it out of the left-hand urn. Okay, that's great, right? Now, I'm going to change the nature of the problem a little bit. I'm going to say I want you to pull out a white marble from the urn this time. Which urn do you choose?
Same one. Same one. Left one.
Interestingly enough, when you conduct this experiment, psychology, something like 90% of people that you poll will say a black marble should come out of here because it's a known mix, right? It's a known. We don't know what the ratio is here. This could very well be 18 white and 0 black. So the chances of pulling a black marble out of there is nil. But then when I flip the problem around, I haven't changed the urns whatsoever. And I say pull out a white marble, people say go back to this one, which is logically inconsistent. Because if you determined in your head that this is better for pulling out a black marble, why would you go back to it for a white marble?
Because I know if I pull 10 stones, I'm going to get one in the right color.
You don't know that there are. You don't know the mix here, though.
That's correct.
You know the mix here.
I know 10 will determine.
But you don't get to pick 10. You get to pick 1. And if you decided this urn was better for pulling out a black marble, why is this one better for pulling out a white marble? You're saying this urn is better for both black and white marbles. That's just inconsistent, sir. Oh, yes, it is. This is known. I'm not making this shit up, guys. This is psychology. And I know computer scientists are like, oh, that psychology shit can't work. Because that's all soft, foofy brain matter stuff. It's not like you've got real software running back there. This is known as the Ellsberg paradox. It's ambiguity. I don't know what's in that other urn. It's the same ambiguity that says, I see, as I'm driving down the freeway, I'm stuck in traffic because it's 5 o'clock on any given day, even Saturday or Sunday here in the Bay Area. And I see people driving off this off-ramp here. I don't know where they're going. They seem to have a little bit better movement, but I'm going to stay right here because I don't know where that goes because I haven't ever been down that road. This is the same thing that causes you when you go to your favorite restaurant. This is the same thing that causes you to go to your favorite restaurant as opposed to picking one blindly out of the yellow pages every night. This is the same thing that causes you to want to order the same kind of food every night, because what happens if I order something and I don't like it? Now, obviously, there are times when you say, I'm going to try something different today. I'm willing to risk the ambiguity. You're willing to risk. You're willing to go past this fear of the unknown. And let's be really blunt here. Fear of the unknown has kept our species alive, because if there were 10 of us and 9 of us wanted to go that way, and one of us, you, wanted to go that way, and you did, and there was a saber-toothed tiger over there, 10 of us could probably beat the tiger. One of us, however, becomes tiger food. Following the herd kept us alive. It's biologically wired into us to follow the herd, to go along with the flow, to let other people figure that stuff out. But it has problems too. Do you know what that is? If I show you this picture, do you now know what it is? When they conducted the post-mortem, pun not intended, when they conducted the review of the Challenger failure, they determined, of course, that it was those faulty O-rings that caused the superheated gas to leak out and basically you blow up the center tank. But this turned out to, in fact, be a known flaw. The subsequent investigation found the failure probably began with the faulty design of its joint and increased as both NASA and contractor management first failed to recognize it as a problem, then failed to fix it, and finally treated it as an acceptable flight risk. Think about this for just a moment. You're sitting in a room with a whole bunch of really, really smart engineers, and you're looking at the plans for the space shuttle. And you know that these rings, when it gets below freezing, they will freeze. They will not expand, because you're familiar with the material. And you know it won't expand, because you know metal contracts and expands depending upon the weather around it. And if the ring doesn't go with the flow, those super hot gases are going to leak out next to what is the largest non-nuclear bomb in history. And you say, hey, guys, are we really sure we're okay with this? And all the other engineers in the room say, yeah, it's not a problem. Because that's what happened. They sat around a room, and at first, they denied it was a flaw. They denied it was a flaw. They said it's not a problem. It won't happen. We're never going to launch from any location where it might dip to freezing the night before. And then they said, well, it's not fixable. We would have to completely redesign that part of the space shuttle. We've already got 5 of them in the fleet, and it would ground the fleet. And then they said, finally, you know what? It's a problem. We could fix it, but it's an acceptable flight risk. Now, I just want to poll the room. How many of you, if I told you that your car has, say, perhaps a 5% chance of blowing up when you turn the key in the ignition and you drive for a couple of minutes, if it was freezing the night before, how many of you are going to treat that as an acceptable driving risk? Show of hands. You scare me, sir. And yet, NASA, the people to whom we turn for measure twice, then measure twice again, then measure twice a third time, because we want triple redundancy before we do anything. NASA said it was an acceptable flight risk. What the fuck? this goes on inside of companies every day, whether you realize it or not. Imagine for a moment you are in college and you are asked to participate in a psychological study, because psychological studies are always conducted on college campuses for two reasons. A, that's where psych professors hang out, and B, college students are poor and need money. They will do anything to get pizza money. So you're brought into a room and there are 11 other people, and you're shown a picture. Here we have 3 lines, here we have 3 other lines, those should actually be scooted over there. A, B, C. Which of these is the same length as this? Wait a second. It's not your turn. First person in the room says A. Second person in the room says A. Third person in the room says A. 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 Your turn.
D.
But see, you spoiled the experiment. Because it turns out, psychologically speaking, when you conduct this and do whatever the story is, whatever the particular exercise is, the exercise is not whether or not you can measure the length of the line. The exercise, what will you say when everybody in the room disagrees with you? 90% of you will go with what the rest of the room says. And when these people were interviewed after they left, several of them said, well, you know, from where I was sitting in the back corner, it kind of looked like, you know, or my fingers are kind of, you know, maybe, and in fact,
converging lines.
Right, it's perspective. As a matter of fact, several of the participants agreed and said, no, A was clearly the right choice. Now, we repeat this experiment again. And this time, again, the only person in the room who's the actual subject of the experiment, of course, is the person sitting in juror seat number 12. The other 11 are plants. If all of them say A or C, whatever the wrong answer is, 90% of the time people will go with them. Interestingly enough, if just one of them offers up a different answer, even if it's wrong, now people are okay with offering up what they believe to be the right answer, because now somebody else has already broken that dissent barrier. As long as somebody disagrees, I feel that much more comfortable with offering up my view of what I think the world really looks like. And this experiment has been conducted over and over and over and over again since the 50s. Consistent results every time. And I will tell you that I gave this particular keynote at a conference and I had somebody come up to me. How many of you are familiar with planning poker? It's an agile term for estimation. The idea is we have a task in front of us and we ask everybody, how long do you think it will take? You offer various estimates. I think it'll take 5 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 5 hours, etc. This guy said, I watched this happen. I said, what do you mean? He said, we were doing some planning poker, and the estimates are supposed to be hidden and then revealed. So you think about what you're going to do. Playing cards are often used for this, or Mike Cohn actually has some planning poker cards specifically for this purpose. So you pick a card, you put it face down, everybody reveals at the same time. And he said, I watched it. 5, 5, 6, 5, 17, 4, 5. And everybody looked at the 17 and went, what? And the 17, he said, I'm not making this up. The 17 hours said, wait, let's do it again. Guess what happened? 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, all the way around. I was thinking that something was going to be harder than it was. I didn't realize you guys were all more expert at this than I am. Oh, the rationalizations flow off the tongue so easily. The average guess of a group of individuals is better than any one individual's. You ever played those guess the amount of candy corn in the jar games? Turns out any one estimate is likely to be statistically wildly off, but collectively, if you average them all, it's almost right. Almost universally, it's better than any one person's guess. The herd is frequently right, which makes it really, really hard to stand up and say, yes, herd, you're going that way, and I'm going that way. Saber-toothed tigers be damned. That's really hard. So since we are influenced by all these emotions, clearly the right thing is to channel Mr. Spock and say, no more emotions. Unfortunately, you can't. Turns out that the emotional centers of your brain are the ones that actually make the decisions. There have been studies where people have had portions of their brain separated, right, either by accident or through actual physical surgery. This has happened, for example, in certain epileptic patients. And when presented with a very simple decision, when should we meet for our next appointment, they literally cannot come to a decision because all of the variables involved are just way too many to comprehend in any sort of logical fashion. When we've watched people's brains, we show them some data, and the decision-making parts of your brain fire before the analytical parts do. So you make a decision, and then you start looking for the reasons why your decision is correct. And don't say it doesn't happen to you, because unless you are an alien in a human body, it's fucking science, people. They've watched your brain under a microscope. The iconoclast feels fear. There's no question about it. There's a tremendous amount of fear involved in doing all of these things. The iconoclast accepts it and runs with it and says, you're right, I could be wrong. And you know what? That's actually one of the biggest problems with most American corporations today, is the fear of being wrong. If you're wrong, I'll fire you. Ooh, better to do nothing than be wrong. You know who this is? That's not me, by the way. This is David Hannemeyer Hansen. This is the guy who created Rails. This particular slide, by this point, is very well known within the Ruby and Rails community, as well as within the larger community, because this was, I believe, during the presentation of Rails 3.0 at a Rails conference that he was invited to. And he was saying, hey, we've gotten a lot of requests from a lot of people as to what features should show up in Rails V next. And here's what we're going to do. Pow! And his point was absolutely that. We know better what should go into Rails than any of you. We know better. So all of your requests, DHH was brilliant. There is no question. DHH created Rails, which had an amazing number of innovations within it. Small innovations, perhaps. Because at the end of the day, it's just a web app. But there were a lot of really good things. There is no web framework today that cannot trace part of its roots to the innovations that DHH created in Rails. But DHH is not considered an industry thought leader. He's not considered somebody that you would want to bring in front of your corporation. He's not somebody you'd want to sit down in front of your executive team. He's not somebody that you want your developers emulating. Because the dude is just offensive. For its own sake, sometimes. He will stand up there and he will say, you are not nearly as smart as me. And I lead Rails, so I will tell you what you want. Okay, just out of curiosity, how many of you, if you said that to one of your customers, would still have a job in the morning? Right? There's this concept of social intelligence. You know who he is? Yeah, you're reading across the bottom. Yeah, I know it's there. It's there. You know what he did? He invented FM. Interestingly enough, one of his best friends was working at RCA, and RCA was heavily invested in AM, which was the technology of the day. And he demonstrated that FM was technologically superior to AM. Matter of fact, one of his most poignant demonstrations was he tuned to the FM band during the middle of a thunderstorm. This was in New York, lots of thunder, lots of lightning. All the AM bands were basically nothing but noise. And FM came through clear as a bell. Sarnoff, his friend, immediately ordered all of RCA's engineers to come up with reasons why FM sucks. Because they were heavily invested in go back and rip down all those AM towers and put up FM towers would have meant, imagine ripping out every server you own and replacing it with something else. And I'm not talking the software. I mean the physical hardware. Rip it all out. Armstrong could not get anybody to listen. On the 40th anniversary of his discovery, he jumped out of his Chicago apartment window. His wife divorced him. His friends basically left him. He saw the world differently. He faced his fear and got nothing. And of course, shortly after his death, the world discovered FM and said, this is so much better. Why do we still use these stupid AM towers? But by that point, it was too late. This is the fate of the iconoclast who cannot get his message across. This is what social intelligence is for. You need to be able to reach people. You need to be able to communicate your message to them in a way that they will be able to comprehend, to absorb, to get behind, to feel in some respects. If you cannot convince anybody of the power of your vision, you are Cassandra.
If I may make a comment, Nikola Tesla, the father of dozens of our modern civilization's inventions, died penniless.
And
He
alone.
was the father of AC power.
Yep.
Edison tried to discredit his AC in favor of Edison's DC.
Absolutely. It's another perfect example here. Absolutely. Almost the exact same story to a T. And again, why was Edison successful and Tesla not? Because Edison was loved by the American public, and Tesla was this weird foreigner dude who had some pretty strange personal habits. We won't go into that. Speaking of strange personal habits, do you know who these two are? Picasso and Van Gogh, right? These two, bearing in mind that some of you may not be, in fact, art history majors, are they good artists? I mean, can we call them, like, decent painters? Yeah, most people actually consider them to be masters. Pablo Picasso's estate in 1973 was estimated at $750 million. He is the only one giving Chihuly competition at this point. 13,000 paintings, 300 sculptures. They loved him. And I do mean literally loved him. Picasso was well known for having quite the stable of lovers, of both sexes, it's rumored. Picasso, oh my gosh, everybody loved him. There's pictures of Picasso sitting at a state dinner, U.S. government state dinner, with a plate in his hand, and Groucho Marx sitting over here, a plate and a pen. He's sketching Marx on White House china, for crying out loud, and gave it to him. Signed it and gave it to him. Van Gogh died penniless and alone, with 900 paintings to his name. Oh yeah. Yeah. After cutting off his ear and sending it off to the woman that he loved. Yeah. Because that's what you do when you're in love, is cut off body parts and send them to her. Because, Beyonce's, if you loved it, put a ring on it, really takes on new meaning in those cases. Has it ever worked? That's the question. Is anyone here missing a body part that your significant other has in her possession, or his possession?
You take pictures of them.
That's a totally different thing. And that's why we have, like, Facebook, Snapchat, right? The iconoclast, you need to do two things in order to connect with people, in order to have that social intelligence. You need to be familiar. You have to have reputation. You have to have exposure, not that kind of exposure. You have to be familiar to your target audience. The other thing is, you have to have this reputation where people have heard of you even before they see you. You know who this guy is? This is one of the category of actors that people frequently refer to in Hollywood as that guy actor. Actors you've seen in movies over and over and over again, but you can never remember their name.
Alan Rickman.
Yes. And in this particular case, Alan Rickman really became a household name because he was Professor Snape. That's really what catapulted him to be a name on people's... And even then, you had to see him 7 times in 7 different movies in the same role before you knew who he was.
I think
There's a ton of actors that are like this. There are a ton of actors that you see in a movie and you're like, I know that guy. I know that guy. Philip Seymour Hoffman was another one up until some of his breakout roles. The interesting thing is, we know him. We recognize him. That's part of the reason these guys keep getting used. In some cases, there are actors that whose voice are the ones you really care about. Patrick Warburton is one such actor. He's one of these guys with a really deep voice. He's on American Dad and Family Guy and so forth. Because his voice is very well recognized, but you just don't know his name. This is a case where we have familiarity. We know that we know him, but we don't know who he is. This is half that story. Reputation is what people know about you. In this case, Rickman had reputation, but he didn't have name recognition. In the technical space, these shadow networks are at work all the time. This is one such shadow network. You saw it play out about an hour and a half ago. If anybody in this room wants a job, let me know, says Greg, and I will put the resume in front of the hiring manager. Why? Because you're in this room. He doesn't know squat about you other than what's on your resume, and you're in this room, which lends certain characteristics to you as an individual. You care about your work, you want to get better, you're willing to socially network, etc., etc., etc. And if he knows you, all the better. He can go in front of the hiring manager and say, here's a resume, this guy I vouch for, this woman does good work, you should hire them. This is how people get jobs, is through those networks, not submitting through dice.com. That's your weapon of last resort. A combination of these two things is how you connect with people and convince them that you're interesting. The iconoclast does three things. You see the world differently, which means you're using the same eyes that everybody else has. You're perceiving things differently. You face down your fears. Folks, it takes chutzpah to stand up in front of the room and say, I think you're all wrong, and here's why. And you can communicate. You have that reputation. You have that connection. People are willing to believe you because you're not just some weirdo who stepped in out of the street. You're somebody that they've worked with. You've done good work. You have some other credentials to your name. Perhaps you've published. Perhaps you blog. Perhaps you've worked on a couple of open source projects. You have that reputation. You're familiar to them. Therefore, they're willing to give you the credit, the credibility, to see where you go next. Bye. Mr. Chair?
Well, do we have any more questions? I think I have a single question here.
How do you distinguish an iconoclast from a crackpot?
That's a good question. Anything else? That's the problem, is in many cases you can't, which is why that reputation becomes important, right? This is why the way you act at work becomes important. If you come in to work every day wearing shorts and flip-flops in the middle of blizzards, if you're routinely talking to people that aren't there, and if in fact you're advocating Ubuntu over the Mac, clearly your sanity is in question, my friend. So anything you suggest is not going to be treated with the degree of respect and decorum that might otherwise deserve. If you are in fact somebody that the VP knows, you've done good work, etc., this is where your familiarity and reputation work to your favor. So this is one of the things that I have a hard time convincing young engineers. Yes, it's really cool to be the guy that stands out and does things differently from everybody else, etc. But all you're doing is spending all of that social connectivity, credibility on things that don't matter.
Jack Welch is known to be an excellent CEO at General Electric, a former CEO of General Electric. How would you characterize Jack Welch?
He's not an iconoclast, I don't think. And interestingly enough, if we do a certain amount of study, these CEOs that are considered to be really, really good when they move out of the position they're in and try to replicate their success at other companies, often can't. So until a CEO can achieve the same economic miracle at more than one place, I'm not willing to give him any credit whatsoever. I'm going to say he was lucky. And he may still have some good ideas, but just because Wall Street likes him because he made stock price go up doesn't mean that he did what was best for the company. Carl Icahn was considered an amazing CEO. Where is he today? Donald Trump has declared bankruptcy. How many times is he considered an amazing CEO? And yet you go back 20 years, he was the darling of Wall Street. Until you can repeat your success multiple times, let's not give them any more credit than perhaps they're good, perhaps they just got lucky.
I want to add something to the Challenger disaster story, which came out of the analysis. The night before the fatal launch, they were sitting around having a staff meeting on whether to launch or not, and the O-ring problem was known, and the engineers in the room said, don't launch this thing, it's freezing out there. And the managers in the room said, you know, we scrubbed it once, the media are waiting, there are going to be budget hearings real soon, and they launched.
What are the chances that it will actually be a problem? Can you tell me for a fact? I don't know, I haven't read the report, I know this was how the conversation went. Can you tell me for a fact that these men will die? Can you tell me that it's more than a 1% chance that they will die? And the engineers, of course, didn't have that information directly at their fingertips, and they looked at each other and said, well, I mean, I don't want to be the guy going on record as saying we need to scrub the launch. Because what's going to happen, those very same people are going to say, well, that guy there said we need to scrub the launch. And immediately the eyes of the entire nation would be on that guy, causing a multi-million-dollar delay during a time when NASA is scraping for all that. Yeah, you see the pressure that those guys were under. I cannot say with all honesty that I would have done any differently. I'd like to think I would. I really want to believe that, but I'm human.
But there's another lesson in that. When you're the manager, when you're the person with the power to make the decision, it's incumbent upon you to pay attention to the iconoclasts.
More than that even. And here's what I'm going to say. If you're the manager and you're sitting around the conference room table and you're making a decision, and it's a fairly important one, right? Do we kill this project or do we keep it? It's your job as the manager to seek dissent, knowing that all it takes is one voice in the room to say, boss, I think that's a bad idea, and here's why. You must seek dissent. You cannot simply say, oh, well, if nobody says anything, we're all in agreement, because no, they're not. You must deliberately pull it out, because otherwise you could very easily be making a decision that somebody in that room knows is stupid, but nobody wants to stand up and say, boss, we really shouldn't do this, unless there's somebody else who says it first.
Your CEO example reminded me, in the 80s and 90s, they were looking at Fortune 500 CEOs, and an awful lot of them had been gunnery bombardiers in World War II. And so it's interesting to think, what are the common, why is the ability to know when to pull a lever at 30,000 feet to drop bombs, why is that a CEO characteristic?
Have you seen the movie Memphis Belle? It's a great moment in that movie where the story is, of course, of the Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete 25 missions over Europe, which was when the pilots were allowed to rotate back home. They completed their tour. And the Memphis Belle is flying over Germany, getting ready to drop their bombs, and the bombardier can't see the target. Now, they're supposed to bomb this factory. According to the movie, there's a school nearby filled with children. And because they can't see the target, and there's murderous anti-aircraft fire going around, the group has already lost the lead plane twice, and the Belle is now the lead plane. The captain of the Belle is the one in charge of the entire bomber wing. And because they can't see the target, and because he absolutely does not want to bomb the school, because it would just be, who knows what, it would be a blind bombing. he makes the decision to have the entire air group turn around and come back over the target a second time, almost guaranteeing that men were going to die because of that decision. And there's one moment where the radioman / navigator who's watching the bombardier, and he's starting to hear this discussion happening in the cockpit, he lunges for the switch to flip it, because just drop the bomb so we can go home. We're that close to rotating back to the States, and you're going to force us to fly through this flak a second time. And the bombardier says, no, I can't see the target, I can't drop the bombs. That may be one of those characteristics.
You know, you talk about looking at something, things differently, and you list all these iconoclasts. But you know, you can do for something that applies to us.
I would hope a lot of this applies to
Well,
us.
the things to look for. I mean, you can look around your business and think like a contractor. A contractor has a contract for 6 months, 3 months, something like that. And if you don't find more work, you're gone. So you're always looking. You're always searching to find some waste. And there's waste everywhere. And if you find that waste, you've got more work.
There's a lot of different ways to look at it. Put yourself into different shoes. I will frequently take some of my consultants, and when we're having a conversation about, okay, imagine you're the client, you're the customer, you're the guy that we're writing code for, you're his boss. What are your principal concerns? What do you focus on? Because I need to understand how they think in order that we can have a productive communication. We have one client right now, they're neck deep in technical debt. I mean, they are just swimming in technical debt. They inherited a code base from somebody else, a company that they purchased, and trying to convince him to get out of this technical debt, his comment to me was, well, what does any of this do to put more supply in the store? Okay, you're right, it doesn't directly put more supply into the store, but if your website goes down every 30 seconds, people won't give you the supply in the first place. I have to reach him on his level. I have to see the world through his eyes if I'm going to have any success in getting him to agree that the work that we want to do for them will in fact be to their benefit, which then is to our benefit, because then I got more guys who are working.
Okay, let me ask. We've actually gone longer than our normal meetings, probably because we delayed the presentation to get a lot of business out of the way. But are you willing to stay for a few minutes?
I don't fly back until tomorrow, so.
Will you make
Well-
the slides available?
What's that?
Will you make the slides available?
Oh, only because you asked. Say
And
please.
we are creating a video record, and that will be put up on the web.
Thank you,
I will, we'll work something out to make the slides available somehow.
thank you.
Right.
I think,
Okay, well, I think we need to end the meeting because people need to go, and we actually need to be getting out of the way of HP. But while we're putting chairs away and so on, some other you can come up and ask questions individually.